In the early 2000s, Elbow were introduced to me as the new Radiohead, and at a time when every inventive art rock outfit from the UK was being compared to Radiohead, this label was understandable. As the years have passed, it's tempting to say that Elbow have sounded less and less like Radiohead, but in reality, it was Radiohead that went on to sound less and less like the mainstream. Elbow, meanwhile, have occupied a resilient centre for the rest of the pop rock world to orbit around, with Elbow's own developments coming in gradiated differentiations rather than large, noticeable shifts. Unsurprisingly, Little Fiction sees Elbow continuing to produce excellent pop music, albeit with a more upbeat feel than perhaps found on previous albums. There are echoes of other bands to be found here. The Doves on Magnificent, She Says, the Magnetic Fields on Old Disco, and the Velvet Underground on Kindling, to name a few. But Elbow are one of those few bands that are able to rise above these musical similarities and shape something unique. It's not so much that they're copying others, but rather that these previous landmark inventions have since fed back into the pop rock machine and found synthesis, refinement, and development on Little Fictions. Little Fictions is another solid Elbow record, and really at 7 albums in, we shouldn't be expecting anything else. It's expansive in scope yet accessible, heavily orchestrated yet intimate, driving yet reflective, new and at once familiar. Worth a listen.
Agreed, totally. I think refinement is probably the strongest adjective that I would attach to this album. I, again, was not super familiar with Elbow prior to listening to this, but after doing a little homework, I discovered that a couple of the singles that they've released over their expansive career have, in fact, leaked into my ears. What I found most interesting about their history is that they are, from what I can tell, a band that almost wasn't. They won a Battle of the Bands competition, and with that they were signed to a record label that was, prior to the release of their debut album, purchased by a larger record label, and then Elbow were scrapped from the new record label conglomerate. And their debut album was shelved for a time being. So I think it's interesting to think that this is a band that narrowly escaped the death that so many other small bands might fall victim to, and that's being forgotten by the constant churning of a music industry with quite a lot of pop, rock, and indie outfits these days. However, I appreciated that this sounded fresh and contemporary, despite the fact that they have been making music together for, almost 20 years now?
Yeah, a significant period of time.
Absolutely. Immediately, I developed a great attachment to track number 2, Gentle Storm, and that is not because Benedict Cumberbatch is in the music video, although that definitely stirred some feelings for me as a fan of his. One thing that I was struck by is that I did think, and this is not meant to be an insult, although I can see how it would be misconstrued, I did definitely feel some Coldplay vibes on this album.
Yeah, that's not an uncommon similarity to see pop up. This is, I think, perhaps the main, not problem with Elbow, but certainly a distinguishing element is that they sound like a lot of things. Everything that is really distinctive about them is because it's a process of a style or a musical element that exists elsewhere. And yet they managed to put it together in their own way. But I mean, listening through Little Fictions, I was just constantly going, that's the Doves. Yep, that's a Magnetic Fields sort of sound.
I wanted to ask, do you think it's an aspect of the band or the genre? Because I found that a lot of sort of pop rock indie songs blend together, and that's just because I think a lot of them tackle a similar subject matter. There's a certain sort of vocal quality that's popular amongst indie singers. There's a certain sort of production quality that's, popular amongst indie rock. And it's not a bad thing by any means, but I do think that I would wager that maybe it's an aspect of the genre that just makes it hard to stand out.
I think there's an element of the genre that is certainly competitive and is affected by the public demands in the genre more so than necessarily just what the band is trying to do.
Yeah.
I think that some bands will deliberately craft music that is more akin to existing musical ideas, and then there are bands inside of the genre that will stick to one specific idea over the course of their careers, and then there are bands that are generally trying to push the envelope of what the genre is and how they're operating inside of this musical representation. I think that with Elbow, a lot of the people who Elbow are compared against are the ones that are pushing the envelope, whereas Elbow is really more about consolidation of those ideas and use them to fuel new material that is unique, but really not original per se. But that doesn't actually diminish from its quality. It's actually kind of nice to listen to a refined version of the sort of more out there ideas that have existed elsewhere. And I think that kind of consolidation is really useful in the pop world. And I think that's what defines really interesting commercial music as opposed to just commercial music, which can operate in more of a regurgitation kind of way.
They have been doing this indie rock sound before some of our more contemporary top 40 favorites have. And I wonder what caused them to not break major airwaves like in the US.
Honestly, I think Elbow were just kind of lucked out by being in the right place at the right time when they were first discovered and when their first couple of albums came out. I mean, certainly it was 2002's Cast of Thousands that set them on the map for me and many, many others. It was very well regarded. And they've kind of just been doing stuff ever since. And I think that those early successes kind of just gave them the momentum they needed to keep going. But I think it's because they're not anything more than what they are. They are kind of just moody dream pop that sits very comfortably inside of a box, that they can't really have that larger scale great success. All they can really do is consolidate a fan base and just be incredibly dependable as producers of music, which is why, I don't think this album is going to set anything on fire, but it's a good album. It's very nicely put together. It's got some great original ideas to it, but it's far from groundbreaking, which, isn't the worst thing in the world.
But it's got beautiful moments, and it seems that is a trend from their extensive discography. Just small moments of almost perfection, and, what else can you ask for?